My name's Patrick Hayes, I'm the director here at BESA, and welcome to our offices for those who haven't been here before. Just a little bit about myself. I'm relatively new to my role at BESA. I'm the new director here. I've been in place for about 6 months now. Prior to that, I spent the best part of a decade at TES, the Times Educational Supplement, which is the lead trade publication for the sector. And that was a range of roles, starting on the news desk and working my way up to various management roles across both higher education, but also at schools as well. And I hope to bring some of that to bear today. And of course, some of the insights that, BESA, working very closely with the industry, is in quite a unique position to be able to provide. So this is basically what I'm going to do. I'm just going to give you just a kind of 3-minute overview of BESA, just so you have a sense of who we are, what we do, and when we talk about education that we actually have some authority and some knowledge of the topic. On the school system, the numbers, but also some key facts that hopefully you'll find useful about the direction of travel. Then some aspects on procurement, so how big are schools' budgets, what do they spend their money on, how do they order. Then the political landscape, and that's changing very rapidly. In fact, I'm having to change my slides almost every other day at the moment as I go around and do this presentation. As you know, we got a new schools minister this time last week, Justine Greening, and we'll talk about that and the potential implications for that as well, for education and for your businesses. Then finally, there's 4 kind of key trends that I've certainly been doing a lot of work observing over the last few years, which I'm keen to talk to you about in the educational landscape in the UK, and we'll touch on that in the last session. But just a little bit about BESA before we start. So we're the only trade association that represents the whole of education, from furniture manufacturers to ICT hardware like Promethean, that's actually this projector that we're using here, to education technology, to the resellers, the kind of Argoses of education. Our patron is the Baroness Hooper, and we've been doing this for 80 years now, so we were actually established in 1933. We have 300 member companies in total, and those can range from the very large, like Pearson, Microsoft, down to the kind of one-man bands, the SMEs, that are providing very valuable products and services at a more local level across the UK school system. Our retention rate is high. And our members have an annual revenue of about 2.1 billion from UK schools. And actually, in terms of UK schools' expenditure in the sector, in terms of the products and services that our members produce, that's about 80% of all UK schools' expenditure. So when we're talking to government on behalf of BESA, we can say we really do represent the vast majority of the industry. And that means that we're taken very seriously. And it also means that we have a responsibility to make sure what your companies are doing is accurately reflected both in the media and also to governments. We don't just work with the big players, we work also with startups, often teachers that have got a great idea for a business but actually need some help and support to really get there. And the launchpad that we have is for companies below 2 years old that basically need that support, the insights that BESA can provide, and also the mentoring that BESA's member companies can provide to really help them get that initial leg up. And we're really pleased that since launching the Launchpad about 3 years ago, various companies have now gone into full membership. They've grown to the point where they're actually able to get the kind of BESA member logo on their website. And this is what we do. So we work with the whole of the education supplies industry, from startups to multinationals, to do 2 things: to help you guys maximise commercial opportunities and to give you the insights and intelligence needed to do that. But really importantly as well, to help your products and services drive up standards across the globe. Education is a sector that I love working in. I've worked in it for the best part of 15 years now. And it is one of those ones where what you do has a direct impact upon the education of the next generation. And it's a great sector. There's a lot of very altruistic people working in it. And it's certainly one that I think you're going to enjoy working in. This is just very quickly the kind of smorgasbord of our members here. You know, you have the likes of Capita and RM, very, very big players. You have the resellers, YPO, you of course have Kent, ESPO, a wide range of EdTech players as well, and of course our Launchpad. And if you look at the breakdown here, you'll see that actually now over 50% of our members are in EdTech and ICT, and that hasn't always been the case. So BESA launched the BET show, the Education Technology Show, which is actually the world's largest now, in 1985. And at that time, the Executive Council in 1985 said, why would you bother with an exhibition that basically showcases ICT? No school will ever need more than one computer. That was the comment at that time. But fortunately, they decided to approve it going ahead anyway. It took place in the Barbican at that point, but now takes place at London Excel every January and is the largest in the world, 40,000 people going there every year. And this is just a few examples of the kind of edtech players we have, the distributors, the furniture companies, and we work very closely with a wide range of media providers as well, from TES, my old company, to The Guardian, to players in early year like Nursery World. We also have all the main textbook publishers working with us. Without further ado, I really just wanted to focus on the basics of the school system. Now, many of you will know this, but there's certainly one thing I wanted to just point out on this slide, because things are changing in terms of compulsory schooling, certainly since I was at school, and probably many of you too. 4 key stages of education within the UK. Starting with early years, which is ages 3 to 4, and then moving into compulsory schooling, which is primary and secondary, ranging between ages 5 to 18. Now, that's changed relatively recently. So it used to be 16. From 2013, that went up to 17, and actually from 2015, last year, that's now gone up to 18, that you have to be in school until the age of 18. That's a relatively recent change. And then, of course, when you hit 18, you can either go off into the workplace, or, of course, you can move into higher education, go to university, as around 50% of the population currently do, or, of course, further education, skills, or kind of skills-based training, or apprenticeships. What's taught? Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on this, but in 1989, the national curriculum came into force, which was effectively central government saying that schools, primary and secondary schools, had to teach certain topics in the curriculum. Prior to that, there was far much more flexibility. Schools could broadly decide what to teach, bearing in mind, of course, that exams had to be taken at the age of 16, the GCSEs, or prior to that, O-levels. But actually, from 1989 onwards, there's been a series of reviews. There's always been a sense that the national curriculum is too unwieldy, it needs to be rationalised, it needs to be slimmed down. And actually, as early as 1993, there was the Deering report that said the national curriculum was unwieldy, and it's been rationalised ever since, really to the point now that if you're an academy, if you're not part of the local education authority structure, you can set your own curriculum. And that's something that you will have heard a lot of talk in the media recently about the fact that the government is pushing to try and make as many schools as possible academies. Increasingly, schools are going to be able to teach what they like and decide upon that themselves. They're not going to have to take a steer from governments. If a school wants to teach Latin, it can. If a school wants to take a particular approach and specialise in a particular area, if it's an academy, it can. It doesn't have to follow what the government instructs anymore. But actually, we are finding that a lot of schools are struggling with that. 75% of schools, for example, are saying that they're finding that difficult because, they're extremely busy and there's a lot going on within a school, and to suddenly have to develop and implement your own curriculum is something that a number of them are struggling with. For those that are still under local education control, and we'll talk about the differences between academies and local education authority maintained schools later on, there are still the 4 key stages within education. So Key Stage 1, 5 to 7, Key Stage 2, 7 to 11, and then at secondary level, Key Stage 3, 11 to 14, Key Stage 4, 14 to 16. But again, we're moving slowly away from that towards more school level control. And actually, time and again within this presentation, I'll be talking about this because there has been a big trend over the last 6 to 7 years of government giving more and more control to schools about how they make purchases, how they manage their budgets, but also how they teach in the classroom. It isn't always the case, and certainly there are government ministers that have certain views which are still very influential, but at the same time, they're not mandated to make these changes in the same way anymore. So let's go really back to the basics here, how many schools there are in the UK. Overwhelmingly, the majority of schools in the UK are primary schools. So there's about 21,000 primary schools in the UK, and just over 4,000 secondary schools. About 7% of people going to school at the moment go to independent schools. Independent schools, there's some slightly odd terminology in around that. People will call them public schools, even though, of course, the public schools are actually private in that they're not funded by the government. They're funded by parents who are paying for their kids to go there. So about 7% go to these non-maintained mainstream independent schools, and there's about 2,500 of those around the country. There's also a number of special educational needs schools and about 350 pupil referral units. And that's pretty much stayed constant over time. There's been a slight drop in the number of primary schools across the country, but actually, if you look at it in total, there's about 32,000 schools in the UK, and that's remained pretty constant. And I think we'll actually, that landscape isn't going to change too much. The vast majority of these schools are in England. So there's around 24,000 schools in England. Most, again, are primary, 17,000 primary schools. And remember, primary schools are relatively small. They tend to be scattered all over the country, particularly in rural areas. There's about 3,500 secondary schools in the UK, and then the independent and special educational needs schools is about 4,000. In Scotland, there's about 5,000 schools, Wales about 1,600, and Northern Ireland about 1,200. It's worth bearing in mind there's only 362 secondary schools in the whole of Scotland. And actually Scotland's educational system is actually significantly different to the rest of the UK. And we'll talk a bit about that later on. In fact, we've got a dedicated seminar on that. So, in terms of the number of pupils, there's about 10 million pupils going through the school system in the UK at the moment. And that amounts to about 16% of the entire population. And this is actually the largest gathering of school kids here in the world. This is in 2013 in Thailand, when 1 million school children came together, amazingly, in one venue to meditate for world peace. And, you know, we've actually got 10 times that amount going through our school system, most in primary. So there's about 5.5 million people going through the primary school system at the moment in the UK, and about close to 4 million people going through the secondary system. Again, the vast majority are in England. There's actually about 1 million teachers who are qualified to teach in the UK, but only half of them at the moment are actually working in the sector. So there's about 510,000 teachers in education at the moment. On top of that, we've actually also got teaching assistants, and one of the things we've seen is a big rise in the UK of teaching assistants over the last 10 years or so, to the point where there's actually about 250,000 now, about 260,000 teaching assistants in the UK. And despite Michael Gove, he declared war on teaching assistants. He thought they were unnecessary. Teachers didn't need that support in the classroom, and wanted to try and cut back on school budgets by diminishing that number. That actually hasn't proven to be the case. The number is still increasing year on year, particularly in primary schools. There are considerably more teachers, 431,000 teachers teaching in England at the moment, 22,000 in Wales, 42,000 in Scotland, and 16,000 in Northern Ireland. Now, one of the other big trends we've seen in terms of kind of teacher demographics over the last kind of few decades is an increase in the proportion of female teachers. So actually in primary schools, there are many primary schools in the country that don't have a single male teacher in them. Only 16% of primary school teachers are currently male, 84% are female, and the proportion's slightly less. In secondary, it's 60% female, 40% male. Overall, about 72% of all teachers are female. And actually, there are fewer and fewer male primary school teachers now. They're becoming a real rarity. So who are they? There's a couple of slides giving you a picture of what a teacher's kind of day-to-day timetable will look like. These are from the University of Warwick. I've anonymised them. But it gives you a bit of a flavour of what they're up to on a daily basis. This is Jenny, a primary school teacher. She's in at 8 o'clock in the morning and works right through to about 6 o'clock. And one of the things you'll see about this timetable, as well as being in front of 30 primary school kids throughout most of the day, she's also on playground duty during break time. She's meeting with parents, she's training the cross-country group. The thing you'll notice about this is that they're extraordinarily busy. Very, very little preparation time during the day. Very little time to kind of hang about in the staff room and talk to colleagues. It's very hands-on, it's very intense. And it's something that we're hearing more and more from teachers, is the case that actually the workload and the burden is causing real problems. In fact, more teachers left the profession last year than ever before. 54,000 teachers decided to move into other areas. And we'll talk more about that later on, because actually as the education supplies industry, while that sounds distressing, we have a real opportunity to work with them to help make their lives easier and to provide them with the products and services they need to manage that workload more effectively. Another thing about Jenny is she did a PGCE, so she did a university qualification to be able to teach in the classroom. It's worth noting that that's changing quite a lot at the moment. You used to go to university for a year and it would be mainly theoretical training. Actually, we've seen a fundamental change in the last 5 years under Michael Gove. He saw teacher training institutions as what he's called kind of the homeland of the Marxist blob, he said. He said, teacher training institutions have a kind of left-wing ideology, which he really despised, an approach to education, which he didn't think was effective. Michael Gove systematically removed aspects of their funding and gave it to schools instead for what was called school direct training. And the big trend we're seeing now in terms of the training of teachers is that teachers are starting to train on the job in classrooms, often actually being paid to do so, rather than having to pay the £8,000 fees they'd have to pay at university. And the schools are taking the lead in the training of those teachers. Again, another burden on schools, but it's a fundamentally different approach. And the majority of teacher training places now are allocated to school directs, not to universities. Her salary is just above average for primary school teachers, but she's earning about £32,000 a year. As a classroom primary school teacher, you don't really earn much more than that. That's about as high as you can get unless you go into a leadership position as an assistant head or deputy head. Secondary, once again, you'll see an extremely busy timetable. She's teaching a lot of different years French. This is Lucy, who teaches French and German. Again, quite a rarity. It's quite hard to find modern foreign language teachers in the UK at the moment. She also did the PGCE. Again, that's changing. Earns a bit more than a primary school teacher, around about 44,000, which again is the high end of a classroom teacher for secondary. I guess the other thing I'll say about the secondary school teachers is there's a tremendous amount of marking and preparation that goes on. That will often happen late into the evening. In fact, certainly in my last job at TES, which had a resources platform for teachers where they upload and download teaching resources, some of the busiest times would be Sunday nights and about 5, 6 a.m. on Monday morning, you know, with them all spending every hour they possibly can preparing for the week ahead. It's quite a task and it shouldn't be underestimated. So just in terms of, you know, how big they are in budgetary terms, well, primary schools, the average budget they have for a year is about £1 million. Secondary schools, it's about £4.5 million. And before any kind of members of the sales team get too excited about that in the room, actually the vast majority of that money isn't spent on the kind of things that suppliers would be providing. It's spent on staff. And actually this is pretty consistent and has been over time. About 80% of a school's budget each year is spent on staff. 15% is spent on running costs, so energy, water, gas, electricity, pensions, insurance. And then really only 5% is spent on educational resources that, you know, are provided by the likes of BESA's members. Now, even though obviously a primary school's budget is much smaller, remember there's 4 times the number of primary schools in the UK than there are secondary schools. So it's not that per pupil they have a lot less money to spend. So this is the amount that they're actually spending on resources. And for a primary school, they have about £41,000 to spend a year on teaching equipment and general classroom resources. In a secondary, they have a budget of around about £180,000 a year. And we'll talk more about the outlook at the moment, but at this point I just wanted to talk a little bit about one of the things that BESA does, which is quite unique, and I'd encourage you to go on the website and take a look at these. BESA is very trusted by its members in that on a very regular basis, members will provide sales information, but also projections in terms of how they think the market's going to do over the next periods. We also do a lot of surveying of head teachers from primary and secondary schools to get a sense of, you know, what they're going to do with their budgets over the next year, how they're going to spend their money. Are they going to buy computers? Are they going to buy textbooks? And we produce these barometers, sometimes for individual segments of our membership, like furniture companies or resellers, other more broad ones as well, which come out every quarter. And the most recent one was done kind of Brexit announcements, but actually it's looking pretty flat at the moment in terms of how the market's going to develop over the next quarter and actually throughout the rest of the year. Negative at the moment at -1%. So I don't think anyone should really expect a big surge in head teacher expenditure over the next periods, but it is remaining relatively flat at the moment. In terms of members in general, about a quarter have a negative outlook, about 20% actually are more positive. But at the moment we're looking at a market that is flat to verging on negative. We'll see how the Brexit announcement starts to have an impact. I think head teachers in general tend to get quite nervous when it comes to any uncertainty and tend to rein in a lot of their expenditure until they're more confident. And we may well see that, although Theresa May now being a Prime Minister rather than a prolonged leadership contest, and having Justine Greening coming in and basically saying continuity, not change at the moment, will do something to kind of steady people's nerves, I think, when it comes to September and October time. So who chooses? Who chooses what the materials, the products, the services that schools acquire? Well, one of the big changes that we're seeing here again is more autonomy down to classroom teacher level. So when it comes to, for example, print and digital content, now, for the first time actually, you could be in a primary academy or you could be in a local education authority secondary school, and the majority of teachers decides themselves about which print and digital content to acquire. Furniture, far less so. Classroom teachers don't get involved in furniture decisions. So that tends to be kind of the head teacher or the school bursar. But actually the big trend we're seeing in terms of digital content, print content, and actually classroom materials as well, is that teachers are getting more autonomy. So how do they order? This is one thing that might surprise some of the newest people into the profession, in that actually teaching is quite traditional in terms of its approach to engaging with suppliers. In fact, the amount of schools using print or kind of traditional methods like post and fax to order goods is actually increasing at the moment. I'm sure as you engage with schools more and more, you'll become familiar with usually the head teacher's PA or the office manager, who is responsible for a lot of the kind of procurement process and basically ordering goods and services. And she's usually been there for quite a long time, often a couple of decades, if not more. She normally has a fax machine that she's been ordering goods and services with for the last 30 or 40 years, and is not going to move away from that anytime soon, no matter how much you ask her to. And actually, it's remarkable. You speak to some companies at the moment who are BESA members, and still 70% of their orders are coming in via fax machine. Which actually, if you think about it, in a time when most of us at home are using, Amazon to order, or using Ocado or Tesco's online shopping, it is quite remarkable that schools are still using this quite traditional approach to ordering and procuring goods, and that isn't changing at the moment. Only 20% of orders are made via the internet at the moment, increasing a little bit. But one of the things that you do find with schools, especially the primary schools in rural areas, is that they lack a decent broadband connection. So actually 38% of primary schools don't have a good broadband connection at the moment. Up to 50% of primary schools don't have sufficient Wi-Fi at the moment in the classroom. Now that's slightly better for secondary, but not by much. And that's something that BESA actually is campaigning quite actively on at the moment. Because if you think about that, that's millions of kids going through the school system, particularly at primary school, who currently aren't able to access the internet in the classroom. And certainly there are people in this room that are developing great products and services that, for one-to-one devices, or that can really help transform education using digital technology that wouldn't have been the case before. Well, kids actually, a lot of kids in the classroom at the moment are not able to access those because they need to go online in order to do so. And that's something that, shouldn't really be acceptable at the moment. About 31% of orders are made through local education authorities, and then about 8% of orders are made via telephone or email. So again, the fax machine, it still plays a big role in procurement in a way that's quite surprising. But anyone in PR and comms, it's probably worth noting that actually. It's a good way of communicating with people. So moving on from school spending priorities, I'll now talk a bit about the political landscape, which, as I said, is changing quite a lot. This is a slide I've had to change pretty recently. This is our new Secretary of State for Education, Justine Greening. So before this, she was in Department for International Development and has actually worked with BESA quite a lot over, in that role. But is very passionate about education. Always get education secretaries who really care about their role. I won't name names, but she actually, from all the speeches I've seen her give, genuinely does care about the sector and has given it a lot of thought. She is now taking the reins. She's been in place for a week now. These are the agencies that kind of report into her. Firstly, you have Ofsted. They're responsible for inspecting both schools and educational institutions and basically giving them a rating ranging from kind of poor or failing to outstanding. And if you walk around schools, if they're doing well, they'll have their Ofsted rating put on banners outside and we'll be boasting around that. Ofsted's, especially at a time when schools are being given more freedom to decide what to teach and how to teach it, are becoming very influential, because the one thing that matters to a head teacher and for a head teacher's future career is a good Ofsted grade. So they will be thinking a lot about structuring their school to ensure that Ofsted gives it the thumbs up when they come and visit and inspect the institution. And Ofsted can sometimes just give 2 or 3 days notice. They can really spring an inspection upon a school, and then of course the school goes into panic mode for a week while it kind of very hurriedly prepares all of its files and paperwork for that inspection to make sure the lessons are absolutely spot on. You've also got the National College for Teaching and Leadership, and their role is really to focus on the quality of education in the workforce. They will help deliver initial teacher training and fund initial teacher training. They also deliver career professional development for teachers, and they'll also be responsible for misconduct hearings. If a teacher, in a worst case scenario, has an affair with a pupil, for example, they'll decide whether or not that teacher will be able to continue to teach in the classroom. Ofqual is the exam watchdog, so there are a number of different exam bodies across the country, especially for secondary, and Ofqual will make sure that the standards are the same, so there's consistency. There's the Education Funding Agency, which really is responsible for the big capital development projects. So, the building of schools, for example, is something that they would oversee. And then there's the Standards and Testing Agency, which for primary school in particular, but actually up to the end of Key Stage 2, so 14 years old, will be responsible for developing statutory assessments, so assessments that are set by the state for students. And then the other thing that's worth noting is that education is broadly devolved in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, so they all have different approaches as to how they teach. Scotland, for example, is much more centralised than the rest of the UK. So there's been a trend in England for schools to get more freedom about how they teach, how they procure goods and services. Actually, in Scotland, it's been the other way round. The Scottish government has had much more control over the way in which schools teach, and they've actually recently implemented something called the Excel framework, which is a list of providers that schools are actually able to procure from. And one of the reasons we've got a big seminar on that is that that's actually coming up for renewal, and it's a strong opportunity for member companies across the rest of the UK to start to make sure they get on that list, because it's very hard for a school to procure if it's not on that framework. Not impossible, but there's a lot of paperwork involved. Another thing about Justine Greening, she's actually the first comprehensively educated Secretary of State for Education. Prior to Justine Greening, most went to public schools, Eton or the like, or they went to grammar schools. So she's actually taking a different approach in that she actually went through the school system that the majority of people in the country have actually gone through, and it'll be interesting to see how that kind of filters down in terms of policy as time goes on. As I said, it's kind of continuity, not change for Justine Greening, because while there's a different face at the top, some of the key figures here, in particular Nick Gibb, the Minister of State for Schools, and Lord Nash, the Undersecretary, haven't changed. They've been in place for quite some time now. And actually they're the ones that, while Nicky Morgan previously was the Education Secretary responsible for obviously overseeing and being the figurehead, sitting around in cabinet meetings discussing education, these were the guys doing the work and making sure everything was being implemented. And Nick Gibb and Lord Nash, extremely influential, have remained in place. So that's why I'm saying there's probably going to be more elements of continuity than change. Nick Gibb has actually been schools minister twice now. In fact, you could almost say 3 times now since he was kind of technically reappointed last week. He is a real kind of traditionalist when it comes to education, which is not necessarily a bad thing, and takes a very principled approach. You get a lot of politicians that kind of move like the wind sometimes in terms of education policy. He has a strong sense of what he thinks education should be and has been very consistent about that. In general, he's a big fan of textbooks and printed material over digital content, and it's definitely worth bearing that in mind. He's also a big fan of knowledge over skills. So he has systematically tried to get rid of what he calls the kind of 21st century skills movement of soft skills being taught in schools. And he's focusing instead on subject knowledge and knowledge for its own sake. He has had fundamental reforms in place, and I would expect those to remain in place now. Lord Nash actually runs his own Multiacademy Trust. We'll talk about Multiacademy Trust later on, but he's responsible for the structural reform of education, the way in which academies have now been developed, the way in which they're now clustered under chains increasingly called Multi-Academy Trusts or academy chains. Robert Halfron hasn't actually taken up his full brief yet. He's been appointed, but we're going to hear more about what his role is at a later stage. We're expecting that he'll take on the further education and skills brief. This guy here that looks like a young Boris Johnson here, who is actually Boris Johnson's younger brother, Joe Johnson MP, is the Minister of State for Universities and Science. And actually one of the big changes that's happened in the last week since Theresa May came into power is that the Department for Education doesn't just focus on schools anymore, it brings back in further education and higher education, which previously were part of the Department for Business. So it's worth noting that one of the big changes Justin Green is going to have to deal with is that reintegration, and also you know, the higher education sector in particular is quite concerned about the implications of Brexit because a lot of its funding comes from the EU at the moment. And you know, while that money isn't necessarily going to go away, I suspect it will come from the UK government. There will be changes there. There'll be changes in priority and the structure of that funding. And Justine Greening has that in her inbox to deal with. Another kind of key individual to point out here is Sir David Carter, who's been relatively recently appointed as the National Schools Commissioner, and he's responsible for overseeing 8 regional schools commissioners across the country. And they're going to be increasingly influential because they are going to be responsible for making decisions around whether or not an academy can be set up within their region, whether or not a multi-academy trust is performing. If a multi-academy trust isn't doing very well, they'll be responsible for overseeing its breakup and potentially moving certain academies out of that. Increasingly, it's very important to be engaging with those individuals. Just one example, and this the Nick Gibb example, about why government remains very, very important, even though actually they're giving much more freedom to schools than ever before. As I mentioned, Nick Gibb is a big fan of textbooks, printed material in the classroom. And when he was schools minister for the first time at the start of the coalition governments in about 2010, 2011, he was a big advocate of textbooks and printed material. And you'll see around the time that he was in office, schools, secondary schools, were spending about £26,000 on textbooks every year. Then he left office for a couple of years, and you'll see what happened. There was a big decline in the expenditure, right down to about 22,000. Then he was reappointed again last year, and we've now seen that projected expenditure in textbooks is going up again. We'll probably see more of that in the next year. And actually, of all the areas, leaving aside ICT, that head teachers say they're going to spend kind of more or less money on, textbooks is the one area where we're going to see an increase in expenditure over the next year. Everything else, from lab equipment to arts and crafts, we're going to see a decrease. And I think it's an important case study to mention because it does show that even though government is technically handing over responsibility to schools about how they spend their money and what they spend it on, actually when the schools minister says you should do something, people do it at the moment. And it's worth noting. It also is worth noting from the point of view of BESA that you know, we need to make sure that we're in there and having an influence. Okay. I wanted to talk a bit about the white paper that came out in March. The white paper is basically the government setting out its stall for what it's going to do for education over the next 5 years. This had Nicky Morgan's name on it. It was called Education Excellence for Everywhere. I suspect there's going to be tweaks to some of this now. And actually it's a good opportunity with a new education minister to come in to actually get rid of some of the most unpopular ideas. But I just wanted to walk through what some of these ideas were, because I think a lot of them won't be going away. And the way in which I wanted to just walk through those is actually to look at what classroom teachers thought of them. So actually one of BESA's members, School Zone, after the white paper was published, actually listed about 20 different kind of key themes in that white paper and asked teachers whether or not they agreed or disagreed. And you'll see here the things they agree with. They agree with proposals like, for example, a new teacher vacancy website to advertise teacher jobs. They agree with the idea of a national teaching service where basically schools in challenging areas or having difficulty can request support from a national body, and that, teachers support training will be able to be designated to that school as a result. Reforms of Ofsted, that's very popular, they like that. There's the idea of a college of teaching. So most professional bodies, like the law or healthcare, will often have a professional body that will represent them. A royal college of nurses, for example. That isn't the case at the moment with teaching, and I think there is a sense that will probably help increase the status of the teaching profession, which is something that's quite important at the moment, especially given so many teachers are starting to leave the profession. Basically, anything to do with an academy or a multi-academy trust is very, very unpopular with teachers. So the one that you may have heard about, it was in all the headlines around March time. It was actually something announced by the Chancellor, George Osborne, even before Nicky Morgan put this paper out there, is the idea that all schools have to become academies by 2022. So they have to be in the process by 2020, by the end of this parliamentary term, and then they all have to convert to academies by 2022 by law. So that was in there in March, and very quickly there was a very fierce backlash against that, not just from Labour, not just from teachers, but also actually from the Tory party themselves. So that's been watered down already, although the government has put into law various things that will allow them to push a lot of maintained schools under local education authority control to become academies, and we'll talk about that in a while. Multi-academy trusts, the idea that we expect most schools to form or join multi-academy trusts, also something that's very unpopular with teachers at the moment. And we can talk a bit later about why that's so unpopular. But teachers in general are quite hostile to the idea of multi-academy trusts and academies. So what next? Now, Justine Greening was on the Andrew Marr show on Sunday, her first kind of interview as the Education Secretary, and basically gave very little away at all. In fact, she kind of didn't say anything during that interview. And I think, fair enough. She was just in place. She needs to get her feet under the table and really figure out a vision for what she wants to achieve. The things that are being talked about, though, there's the talk of a return of grammar schools. It's something that Theresa May is quite a fan of. It's something that Boris Johnson was certainly a strong advocate of. And I think increasingly now, Justine Greening is likely to be taking that seriously. The idea of potentially having free schools that can decide whether or not to admit pupils based upon their ability before they go into the school. That's the kind of grammar school we may well be seeing, a kind of grammar-free school system emerging. On the table for a long time is something called the National Funding Formula, which is going to be the restructuring of how schools get their money. For a long time, actually, it's been seen that certain schools have actually benefited from a formula that gives them more money per pupil than other schools. And actually, that's all going to be kind of shaken up. And the whole way in which schools get their money is going to be transformed over the next couple of years. That's been delayed, but it is still going ahead. There is an ongoing row about term time holidays, and Justine Greening has just said she's going to take a sensible solution to that, which probably means she will allow parents to take some holidays to take their kids out on a reasonable kind of basis during term time. The main issue there, of course, is that holidays are much more expensive during the summer holidays. In the past, there's been no flexibility about that at all. As I said, one of the big things she's going to have to deal with is the integration of higher education and skills into the portfolio. In the past, the DfE just had to focus on primary and secondary schools. She's now got a much wider remit and will be employing more people to focus on that as well. One of the big things that Nick Gibb in particular is a big fan of is what's called Shanghai maths, so the Chinese approach to teaching maths. Chinese do very well in the kind of world international league tables in terms of maths comprehension. That's something that Nick Gibb wants to emulate within the UK, and he's announced a £41 million pot of money to allow schools to train teachers to teach using this method, and also to acquire textbooks that teach Shanghai maths. Still no word on their views about academisation, although given that some legislation has already gone in around that, I expect that things won't change fundamentally. I don't think we're going to hear Justin Greening start calling for all schools to have to become academies by 2020, but that is the direction of travel. There are 4 key trends I just wanted to touch on before I kind of wind up. I've mentioned a lot academies and multi-academy trusts. I just want to talk about that a bit more. It's probably one of the biggest changes that's happened in a generation in UK schools, and it's something that I think it's very important as suppliers in particular we really keep abreast of. There's also a big increase in pupil numbers at the moment. There's been a bit of a baby boom recently, and I just want to talk about that because it does have an impact, particularly on school budgets, and we can talk about that. There's also quite a severe teacher shortage at the moment. There are far fewer teachers in the classroom than are needed at the moment, and certainly will be needed given the baby boom. So that's something that is a very concrete issue that the sector is facing at the moment. And then finally, we are seeing a time when education budgets actually in real terms are being cut for the first time. And it's something that schools are having to deal with in a way that they didn't even need to do during the recession. Education budgets were ring-fenced during the recession at a time actually when most departments were having their budgets cut by about 20%. So we're now seeing head teachers actually having to think, actually, how am I going to be able to cut costs for the first time? And it's a very real problem that they haven't had to face before. So we'll just touch on that. Firstly, on the role of academies. Now, this is the old structure, the way in which the UK used to be divided up in terms of local education authorities. And certainly when I first moved into working in education about 15 years ago, this is what it looked like. So there was 152 LEAs in England, 22 in Wales. Scotland, it's remained pretty much the same. As I said, they have a very different approach. But one of the things that a lot of companies used to have to do is engage with these LEAs. That was their main sales efforts. There was 152 in England. You'd speak to 152 heads of procurement, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and that was your sales effort. Now, of course, that's totally changed. You've got the rise of academies, which are independent of these local education authorities. So they have their control of their own budget, which is given them directly from governments. And the LEAs no longer have any control over how they teach or how they spend their money. So academies are totally independent of this structure. And actually one of the big pushes by governments was to try and get rid of basically all these LEAs. Again, the government, I think, were quite concerned that they were an unnecessary cost. Maybe that their approach to education was quite different to the approach that they wanted to take. And actually, so they've been trying to take away more and more money from the LEAs, to the point now where some LEAs really don't have enough finances to maintain the core services that they offer. Certainly if every school in the country became an academy by 2020, the LEAs would have no funding at all. So academies have risen very, very quickly. They're actually a new Labour idea. They weren't an idea that were introduced by the Tories, although you can see that actually during the coalition government, the partnership between the Tories and the Lib Dems, we really saw a significant increase in the number of academies. But the first one started in 2002, 2003. The big architect of academies was called Lord Andrew Adonis. He's now responsible for driving forward HS2, but he was the visionary that kind of that started off the academies movement, initially focusing on failing schools. So to be an academy in the early days, you had to be a school that was in special measures. And the idea was that basically you would become an academy and would be able to kind of restructure the school to be able to increase its performance. That's now changed. So now any school can become an academy, but certainly failing schools have to be, it's now compulsory. What we saw in the early stages of the coalition government coming in was a massive uptick in the number of academies. So a 309% increase between 2010 and 2011 in terms of the number of academies, to the point where there's now over 5,000 academies in England. Most of these academies are secondary. The majority of secondary schools in the country now have academy status. A much smaller number of primary schools do. There's around about 20,000 primary schools in England. Only 3,000 of those are academies at the moment. So if you think about that, we're looking at 5,000 schools that are academies at the moment. The proposal that Nicky Morgan and George Osborne had earlier on this year was for 15,000 schools to have to convert within a 4-year period. So you can see why there was nerves around that and why that actually didn't end up being in the Queen's speech or turning into kind of law, because it was a hell of a task. And actually it was a task that was going to have to be undertaken with far less money and far less resources. There's been a big pot of money called the Educational Services Grants that academies have been able to tap into to be able to make a conversion in the past. I'll walk you through this chart because it's a little bit complicated. It's one that's produced by TES and a research company called Schools Dash a couple of months ago. And it kind of shows that even though it's no longer going to be law for all schools to have to convert to be academies, actually the government has a couple of sticks they can use to kind of force schools to become academies. And so there are two things that the government can do to basically make sure that schools convert to be academies. If they have a bad Ofsted rating, so anything that's not good or outstanding, then they're going to have to convert to being academies. If they're in a local education authority where there is a critical mass of schools that are academies, then the schools will have to convert. So actually this red zone here are where there are local education authorities where most of the schools are going to have to convert. Bournemouth, for example, is one where the vast majority of schools already are academies. In fact, there's only 3 schools left in Bournemouth that aren't academies. 90% of its schools are, which means that the other 10% are going to have to follow. There's no way, if you think about it, a local education authority can continue to exist when there's only 3 schools that are still paying it money in order to operate. There are some areas, South Tyneside, North Tyneside, Redbridge, certainly perhaps some of the more prestigious areas of London like Kensington and Chelsea, they'll probably be unaffected by academies. Kensington and Chelsea may be the last area in the country where you don't have academies, but certainly in the rest of the country where we see this kind of red, orange and yellow, we'll see a lot more conversion take place and schools will have to convert. Complicating the picture a little bit though, we had local education authorities, 152 in England. We now have the rise of 5,000 academies. These academies are now also clustering into what's called multi-academy trusts. Now they're very different to local education authorities in that they don't have to be regional. So a multi-academy trust, you could have 10 schools all across the country that are part of the same trust. So it's not exactly the same as the old LEA structure that used to exist. In fact, there's already an awful lot more multi-academy trusts than there are local education authorities. There's 846. We're actually hearing that the latest data is going to say there's about 973 multi-academy trusts across the country. And David Carter, the National Schools Commissioner, has said we're going to need at least another 1,000 by 2020. So the rise of these multi-academy trusts is happening extraordinarily rapidly. At the moment, they cover about 60% of academies. So 60% of all academies are part of one of these trusts. And multi-academy trusts broadly are kind of like an umbrella that oversees the operations of academies that are part of the trust. You'll usually have a CEO that is responsible for the combined direction. They tend to centralise services like human resources, procurement is key. And the idea behind that really is that if you have a multi-academy trust negotiating on behalf of 10 schools, they're probably going to get a better deal than if you're a single academy negotiating a smaller contract. So the idea is there's economies of scale, also there's a pooling of knowledge. So 10 heads are better than one, literally I think is the logic, in that they can get together, they can discuss strategy, share experiences, and that pooling of knowledge and experience is seen to be important. There's a very odd phenomenon at the moment where there's actually 212 multi-academy trusts that only have one school at the moment. So it's the rise of the single academy multi-academy trust. It is odd, but actually these mats are actually prepping for growth at the moment. So they've just set up, they're going to be forging partnerships with other academies in the area. It just shows how rapidly this is happening. There's about 40 giants, 40 multi-academy trusts that have 10 or more schools. And actually there's an aim really by the National Schools Commissioner to get all mats to grow to where they have, as he said here, 10, 15, 20 academies as part of the structure. And, there is a question about whether or not they can get too big. I mean, if you think about it, these are, even though these are non-profits, they are companies. And if they get too big, they could end up being in a position where they're almost too big to fail. And you've already seen government having to bail out some multi-academy trusts because they haven't managed their finances right. Another thing that is quite striking is even though there is an argument about the cost savings that you can get through centralisation, you do have now the heads of some multi-academy trusts are earning upwards of £400,000 a year, which is 3 times the amount that the Prime Minister is earning. So there is increased control over, and regulation on multi-academy trusts that's very much in the pipeline. The government's Education Select Committee is looking at that. There's a strong sense that these mats need to be accountable and much more transparent in the way that they operate. And certainly from the point of view of BESA, we've been looking at them a lot recently in terms of how they procure. And we're doing a big bit of research with a company called the Education Company at the moment, because the way in which sales teams from companies such as your own engage with schools is changing a lot over time, because often now schools will be part of a multi-academy trust and they will have an individual within the mats called a head of procurement, a business manager, who will now be responsible for making procurement decisions in a way that schools used to be. And we're finding that sales teams are saying to us at the moment, it's a bit of a nightmare because we're having to spend loads of time researching who the right people are, because you go to the school and they all say, oh, speak to the mats, they're responsible for this. And you speak to the mat and they'll say, speak to the schools. It's a bit of a minefield at the moment, and we're trying to clarify that through systematically talking to every mat in the country about how they procure. That, of course, is changing as well, and this is a very early cut of some research that shows how mats are planning to develop over time in terms of how they procure products and services. And actually, you'll see for something like utilities, about 80% of all mats say that they want to centralise their purchasing of utilities. ICT equipment as well, almost 70% of mats say that they want to have central control over the purchase of ICT equipment. Less so for learning resources. As I said, increasingly for learning resources, teachers are still going to be responsible. But actually, if you're working in assessments, almost 50% of mats say they're going to be responsible for that. The number of pupils is set to increase quite a lot over the next 5 years. And there's been quite a baby boom at the moment. Actually, there are going to be more pupils going through the school system than at any point since the 1970s, late 1960s, 1970s. And that has already been taking effect at primary school level. It's about to really bite in secondary. So we're going to have a much larger volume of pupils entering into secondary than we have since the 1970s. And that's going to put a burden on secondary schools, because we're at a time actually where secondary schools are struggling to recruit teachers at the moment. But also, as I said, the schools are facing cuts for the first time. So what the government will say at the moment is that they're not actually making cuts. There's just basically a freeze on education budgets. So we're not reducing education budgets, we're just keeping them the same. What they don't say, though, is that actually schools are going to have to do a lot more with less per pupil. Because, yes, they're keeping budgets the same, but they're going to have a lot more pupils coming in. So per pupil, budgets are dropping quite considerably. We'll talk about this later on. But the estimate by the Institute for Fiscal Studies at the moment is that schools are going to have about 8% less budget per pupil over the coming periods. So it's important to note that when government says we're not cutting education, actually per pupil they are. So legally, schools cannot have class sizes larger than 30 kids. And that isn't going to change. It'll be a kind of political dynamite for Justin Greening to make an announcement to parents that they're going to increase class sizes. Because statistically, the larger the classes are, normally the lower performing the pupils are. So they're going to have to find teachers from somewhere. At the moment, if you just look at this line, we're not seeing a great increase in the number of teachers that are coming in. So the number that are expected, based upon current projections, is actually much lower than the number that's going to be required due to the number of new pupils coming into the sector. In fact, our estimate is that by 2024, there's going to be a shortfall of about 50,000 teachers in the sector. And it's worth bearing that in mind, especially given the fact that there is an increasing shortage of teachers. One of the reasons for that is actually, bizarrely, a recession is quite a good time for the teaching profession, because private sector jobs tend to be fewer, they tend to be worse paid during a recession. Graduates tend to move into what they call kind of safe haven jobs like teaching. It's a bit of a bolt hole for them. There aren't that many graduate opportunities in the private sector, so they move into the public sector instead. And actually during the recession, there were too many graduates applying to be teachers. That certainly isn't the case now. In fact, just 82% of secondary places allocated for graduates last year have been taken up. That isn't changing at the moment. The average graduate teacher going into the profession earns £6,000 less than the average graduate salary in general. And that's something that needs to be addressed, I think, because it's going to be very hard to get talent back into the profession. Other issues, I won't go on all of these, but more teachers are leaving the profession than before. I said around 54,000 last year. A lot of them are going overseas. So they're not just leaving the profession and going into other jobs. We're actually seeing the rise of the international schools system across the world. And the vast majority of these international schools teach the UK curriculum. They will provide better salaries for teachers, usually tax-free. And it's a great opportunity for teachers, especially young graduates, to go abroad on a kind of, and to gain experience and a salary they wouldn't get in the UK. So we are seeing teachers training in the UK and then immediately going abroad. And that's a trend that will only increase because it's estimated that by 2020, international schools will have as many teachers as the UK does in total, so about 500,000. One of the other key things, and we'll talk about this more in a second, is the greater demands on existing workforces. So when schools convert to become academies, we do see a real impact upon teachers' workload in general. Academies operate much more like businesses. There's a real focus on efficiency savings and efficiency drive. And we're finding that teachers who are already overworked, I've kind of walked you through their timetables earlier on in the session, just can't cope anymore. I mean, teachers love what they do. They're not in it for the money, but they're really struggling to cope at the moment. I mean, when I talk about the teacher shortage, I'm not really talking about primary. In fact, in terms of the government's quota, and this is the percentage of the quota for new entrants, the primary is ahead of the curve at the moment. About 117% of the target was met last year, but secondary it's well down, so it's about 82%. And if you're a history teacher or an English teacher, you're actually going to struggle to get a job at the moment because they're really in demand. So in 2016, for example, they reached 113% of the history teacher quota, 103% of the English teacher quota. Now that's dropping. It was 137% the year before. PE teachers are relatively, there's quite a few of those as well. But if there is a real shortage of art teachers, RE teachers. Design and technology, only 41% of the quota was met last year. I mean, it's really quite bad in some areas, particularly in kind of STEM and science subjects, where compulsory to teach, but it's really hard to get talent into the classroom to teach kids, and that's having a kind of a knock-on effect where actually you're starting to have a lot of teachers who are not qualified in their subject trying to teach people maths and sciences, and it's causing real problems in terms of attainment and results. One of the things they have tried to do around this is actually to reduce the old pay scale framework for teachers so that schools, particularly academies, can pay a lot more for maths teachers than they can for English teachers, which makes a lot of sense in terms of attracting a higher quality of graduate into the profession, but actually is causing inequity when they get there. So I mean, imagine if you're an English teacher and you're earning, you've been working in the classroom for 5 years longer than the maths teacher, but you're earning 10 grand less. It's not a nice feeling, I would suspect, and it's one that the unions are having problems with at the moment. Now, you'll hear these stats, and I don't want to kind of shy away from them. You'll see stats like this all the time, in that a lot of teachers are saying they're thinking of leaving the profession. So 53% of teachers in this YouGov survey say they're thinking of leaving the profession in the next 2 years. 59% have considered leaving in the past 6 months. And that's changing over time. So it's not just they're cynical and they say, oh, I hate my job, I want to leave. That actually wasn't the case, say, 3 or 4 years ago. They are increasingly finding that the volume of workloads and work-life balance is a real problem for them. And you'll see here in terms of what are the reasons as to why you're thinking of leaving. Seeking higher pay is one of the least reasons. You know, they're not in it for the money. They're not trying to get more cash by leaving the profession. It's the volume of workload, it's the work-life balance, it's unreasonable demands from their managers, particularly as they convert to academies, which are starting to structure much more like businesses. So again, another survey by Pearson, 76% of teachers saying the workload's too high at the moment. I mean, fundamentally, teachers are very altruistic by nature. You know, while they are struggling at the moment, you know, they really love what they do. And if you ask them why they became a teacher, you know, it's because they enjoy working with children and young people. They want to make a difference. Every day is different. There's a lot of variety. So, I mean, I think it is important that when teachers say the workload is too high, the government in particular does respond to that. Nikki Morgan has had a series of workshops, which she calls the workload reviews, to try and better understand what could be done and to offer some guidance. And BESA have been participating in those. But I think there is a bit of a sense that they could be talking shops at the moment, and actually not enough concrete kind of investments and changes have been made to really help ease teachers' workloads. And that is going to be difficult come, you know, given the recession at the moment, and given the fact that budgets are being cut. But again, while it's a bit of a bleak picture in terms of teachers leaving the profession at the moment, as I said, there's a real opportunity here as the education suppliers community to try and find ways in which we can help make their lives easier. The final trend I just wanted to talk about was just to touch on the Institute for Fiscal Studies research that actually suggests that real school spending per pupil is dropping. Because even though education budgets are ring-fenced in that they're not being technically cut, as I said, the number of pupils coming into the system is increasing, which means that per pupil expenditure is going down. And that's something that schools are having to deal with for the first time in a generation. They've never had to deal with smaller budgets before. So really, I just wanted to then just summarise. So we talked about the rise of academies and multi-academy trusts. We talked about the increased pupil numbers and the teacher shortage that's really biting at the moment. And then also, on top of that, we're seeing the education budgets facing real terms cuts. But I just wanted to kind of really emphasise that it's not just all doom and gloom. There are real opportunities here, especially for suppliers in the sector. There is a real interest from teachers and schools in finding ways in which teachers' workload can be better managed, in which we can come up with innovative new resources to help make teachers' lives easier in the classroom, to help support them, provide a higher level of education, but in a more effective way. Schools are also becoming more like businesses, as I mentioned. A lot of schools are now getting business managers for the first time. The MATs certainly are. And what they're doing is they're looking at a lot of their historical contracts, so the ones that have been in place for the last 2 decades. They're now starting to look at those and thinking, actually, are we getting value for money here? You know, are they the most efficient contracts? Are they the most effective contracts? And there is a real opportunity then for suppliers, because it is a case now of being able to basically start to go to schools, go to the business managers with a better proposition and getting a hearing for the first time. So while you know, you certainly hear teachers complain about schools operating more like businesses. Actually, from a supplier's point of view, there are opportunities there, because it means that the kind of arguments salespeople would normally make will be listened to a lot more. It's not just about, you know, a relationship that you've had with a supplier for the last, you know, 3 decades. It'll be more about the data, you know, whether or not the goods and services that you're buying at the moment are really having an impact. Finally, I think one of the big changes is the rise of academies and multi-academy trusts. And I think the real opportunity for suppliers there is the landscape's changing so quickly. Keeping abreast of that means that you'll keep on top of it in a way that your competitors might not be doing. And certainly I've heard people, not BESA members, but people within the industry saying, when's it going to go back to the LEA structure? It was really straightforward when we just had 150 people to talk to. And the answer is it's not. It's going to change. It's going to keep changing over the next 5 years. But those people that say, let's just ride it through and wait until it turns back to the old way of doing things, will probably struggle. I would encourage you to keep abreast of the work we're doing on Multi-Academy Trusts and to really think about that change as an opportunity. So, just finally, very much related to that, I just want to talk briefly about what we kind of offer at BESA, because certainly I found it quite remarkable just how much research and insights BESA provides to members since I came in 6 months ago. That's actually increasing now. We're doing a lot of work on multi-academy trusts and international schools. We have over 20 research reports that we produce a year, and lots of seminars and training events, not just this one, but we have one, as I said, on procurement in Scotland coming up next week. We had one last week on the rise of multi-academy trusts. We have a wide range of seminars, which are all filmed by WorldRite, so you can just go on YouTube and check them out rather than having to always come here in person. We have a lot of tender updates that we produce on a weekly basis. So when either within the UK or internationally a big contract comes up, go on our website and you can become aware of them in that way. We also do a lot of influencing, so we run something called the Secretariat for something called the Education All-Party Parliamentary Group, which is a cross-party group of MPs that care a lot about education and come together on about every month or so to discuss key issues, and we can invite members along to that to help kind of work with MPs to flesh out what to do about it. We also coordinate the judging for the BET Awards and the Education Resources Awards, the two big awards in the sector, and both of those have a call for entrance at the moment. So if your companies haven't applied for those awards, it might be worth thinking about doing so. We also, of course, set up the BET show, which we still work with a company called I2Y on running on an annual basis. The next one's in January, and it's the largest education technology show in the world. It's a mile from one side to the other, and it's really a sight to behold if you've never been before. We also run the education show, which takes place in the NEC in March, and the SSAT conference, the Specialist Schools and the Academy Trust conference that takes place in December. We're also a trade champion working with UKTI to take UK businesses abroad and to exhibit their goods and services to the international education community, something that's increasingly important at the moment given the slight downturn in terms of education budgets in the UK. And we can often give you bursaries to exhibit internationally where, which will cover a lot of your costs. So do speak to us about that if that's of interest. And then another thing that is very important is that for the last 80 years, the BESA logo has been recognised by schools as basically a kite mark of quality. So all of you as BESA members can have the BESA logo on your website and on your marketing collateral, which says to schools, this company has signed up to a code of conduct, which means that it's transparent, it's accountable, it's reputable in a way that companies that aren't, we can't necessarily be sure that they can be trusted. And importantly, if you sign up to the BESA Code of Conduct, if you have our logo, it means that your finances have been checked by our Executive Council and that you're not going to go bust tomorrow. So it is well worth mentioning to schools, if you're engaging with them, that you are BESA members, because it is a mark of quality. And then finally, this is the team. So myself and Caroline are the directors here. Caroline's my boss. We have a strong team of managers. William, who's our international manager, Mark, who does our website and comms, and Tim, who runs events and membership. And we're all very willing to talk to you at any points. If you've got any questions about the sector or about, kind of operations within your businesses, we're always there to have a conversation with you about that. We operate as a non-profit. Our raison d'etre, the whole reason for BESA existing is to better support the industry and to make sure that you realise your goals. Our boards, our bosses, are an elected group of representatives from the industry, a real range from kind of edtech companies like GroupCool to resellers like ESPO and YPO to sticker companies. And they are the people that we meet with on a quarterly basis and set the strategy and direction with us. So our only reason for being is to help give you guys the guidance and support that you need. Our door is always open. So I hope this was useful, and please do come along to some other BESA events in future. And just email me if you've got any questions. Thanks a lot, guys. Cheers.